In this component-free screencast, we're going to look at a range of ways in which sociologists and the government have defined and operationalised the concept of social class. Social class is widely believed to be one of the most important forms of social division and social differentiation within contemporary Britain. Now, it can be difficult to define precisely what is meant by social class, but usually the term denotes a group of people in society who share a similar economic position or status. In other words, it's a group of people who share roughly the same standard of living. Now, traditionally, sociologists have often tried to fit people into one of three categories. So a small minority of the British population have been viewed as the upper class. So this has consisted of the aristocracy, the owners of big business and the very rich. At the other end of this class structure, we've got the working class, and traditionally this has included people who work in manual jobs. That's jobs where people use their hands, and that's included traditionally things like factory work and people working in heavy industry. And then in between these two classes, we have the middle class, and traditionally the middle class are comprised people who are better off than the working class and usually do jobs where they do not work with their hands. So this has included non-manual work, such as office work, and also the professions. So by the professions, I mean things like law, teaching, medicine, etc. Also, some sociologists, particularly those influenced by new right or neoliberal ideas, have also identified a fourth social class that is sometimes referred to as the underclass. And the underclass are people who perhaps get their money mainly from state benefits, and they include the long-term employed, the homeless, and also sometimes this particular notion of an underclass also has criminal connotations. Now, personally, I don't like the concept of the underclass because I think this is a concept that has been used to negatively stereotype and stigmatise the poor and the vulnerable. Instead, I much prefer the concept of the precariat to describe people at the bottom of the class structure. That's a concept that I'll return to at the end of this screencast. Now, there can be many difficulties involved in trying to define and measure social class, which is what I mean by the idea of operationalising social class. And in practice, most sociologists have relied on something tangible and easy to use, and in particular, they tended to focus on people's occupation, on the jobs that people have done, since that's an objective fact that most people can agree on. Occupation has also been the key indicator of social class used in official government measures, and until the year 2000, the government measured social class using this particular scale that you can see on the screen at the moment, called the Register's General Scale. So as you can see here, in this particular classification system, people are allocated to one of five social classes based on the type of job that they do, with the key distinction being this distinction between non-manual work and manual work. Now, there are all kinds of problems with this particular way of classifying social class, and we'll explore some of the major problems with this particular scale in class. So since the year 2000, the government has used a new scale to classify people's social class. This is known as the National Statistics Social and Economic Classification, and as you can see, it divides the population up into 8 social classes, and the way in which these are ranked is based on 3 main areas. It's based on employment relations, so that's whether or not somebody is an employer, self-employed or employed, and whether or not they are salaried or whether or not they're paid a weekly wage. It refers to their labour market situation, which is their income, their benefits, the job security and promotion prospects associated with their job, and also their work situation. So that's where the person is within their workplace hierarchy and how much control or autonomy that they have when they're at work. An alternative way of operationalising social class was proposed by Mike Savage and his colleagues in the Great British Class Survey. And this particular scale was drawn up by asking members of the public to answer a raft of questions in a BBC internet survey that was called the Great British Class Survey, and this survey was based on the responses of over 160,000 people who took part in the survey. So the Great British Class Survey adopted what is known as the capitals approach to class. So rather than focusing on occupation or job as an indicator of social class, this particular survey attempted to measure the amount of economic, cultural and social capital people possessed in order to ascertain their social class. And what we will do in our lessons is have a look at the actual questions that were used as part of this survey so that you can see the precise ways in which the Great British Class Survey measured these concepts of economic, cultural and social capital. And according to this survey, there are now 7 new classes in the United Kingdom, which we'll look at in more detail in lessons. Now, the findings of the Great British Class Survey, which was done in conjunction with the BBC, have been written up into this particular book that was published in the autumn of 2015, called Social Class in the 21st Century. And the key arguments that Mike Savage and his colleagues put forward in this particular book is that we're seeing massive polarisation between the top and the bottom. So there are huge gaps in economic, social and cultural capital if we compare the very top social class, what is referred to as the elite in this particular model, and the precariat, who we'll talk about at the moment, who are the social class at the bottom of this particular model. Now, in between these two extremes, things are a lot less clear-cut, according to Mike Savage and his colleagues. So we see a lot of fragmentation in the middle, a lot of fluidity with the divide between the established middle class and the traditional working class not as clear-cut as was traditionally believed to be the case. So the overall argument of this book is that social class remains a key feature of British society, but it's not the same as social class in the early part of the 20th century, that social classes and the boundaries between social classes have changed over time. So this idea of the precariat has been identified by some sociologists and economists as a new social class, and it gets at the idea that there's now a significant chunk of the population, and according to the evidence in this book, we're talking about 15% of the population who are in very insecure jobs and positions within their life. So people in this bottom social class are not necessarily unemployed, but they're often people who are working in low-paid jobs and moving from one casual job to another. And this means that their existence and their income is very precarious. It's very uncertain because they don't know what the next week or the next month will bring, and they have to live from one day to the next. And the increasing number of zero-hour contract jobs within the British economy can be related to this idea of the precariat. Finally, it's important to recognise that the way in which sociologists and the government categorise social class does not necessarily chime with people's subjective views of social class. So a subjective definition of social class is based on what an individual actually feels their social class position to be. So for example, a self-made millionaire may be middle or upper class by all objective standards of wealth and income, but they might still subjectively perceive themselves to be working class, and they might still mainly have working class friends and share a working class culture. Furthermore, some people might not even see themselves as being part of a social class. And Mike Savage found in his in-depth interviews that there was a marked reluctance amongst his interviewees to assign themselves to a class in a specific way. So he found that most people valued being normal and just like everybody else above a specific class label for themselves.